The diner was supposed to be closed, but 3 out-of-towners didn't care. They cornered the young waitress near the counter, laughing as she tried not to cry. What they didn't notice, what they never even thought to check, was the retired Army Ranger standing quietly in the back, watching everything unfold. This moment, this breath before justice steps forward, isn't where the story begins. It's where every choice, every warning, and every test of character has finally led. If you believe in courage, integrity, and standing up for those who can't, stay with us. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. Emily Carter moved slowly through the quiet diner, wiping down each table with the kind of tired precision that came from years of long shifts and even longer nights. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting a soft red glow across the booths and the framed photos of veterans lining the wall. She could hear the steady hum of the refrigerators in the back and the faint rustle of leaves outside as the wind brushed against the glass. It was the kind of late hour when the world feels safely tucked away, and for just a moment, she believed she could finish the night in peace. Her shoulders eased as she folded a dish towel, thinking about heading home to her small apartment just beyond the cornfields. Jack Coleman sat in his usual corner booth, his hands wrapped around a chipped white coffee mug that had been refilled more times than Emily could count. His calm presence blended into the room the way a worn leather jacket fits the shape of its owner. Steam curled up from the fresh pour Emily had given him earlier, and he watched it rise like a quiet companion in the otherwise empty diner. Jack had the look of someone who had lived long enough to understand silence, but still carried an alertness just beneath the surface. The world might have already decided he was retired, but his eyes said something different entirely. Outside, the sky over the farmland was deep black, the kind that swallowed the last traces of daylight without apology. Emily glanced toward the windows, seeing only the faint glow of distant barn lights scattered like quiet sentinels across the fields. She double-checked the locks on the side door, something Frank and Linda, her bosses and the diner's owners, had taught her to do ever since she started working there at 17. Small-town life made her feel safe most days, but late nights always carried that lingering unease, even in a place she knew so well. Tonight, she brushed off the feeling, convincing herself that nothing ever truly happened here. Jack watched Emily move from booth to booth, noticing the fatigue behind her small, polite smile. There was something familiar about the way she kept pushing through exhaustion, refusing to cut corners even when no one was watching. It reminded him of young soldiers he'd once trained, kids who wanted to prove they were strong enough to carry more than anyone expected of them. He didn't intrude or make small talk. He simply observed, his instincts quietly cataloging details without conscious effort. Years of discipline had turned awareness into reflex. Emily flipped the open sign to closed, letting it dangle softly in the window as the last glow of its red letters faded into the night. She locked the front door, tugging on it twice like she always did, making sure it wouldn't budge. The diner felt smaller now, more intimate, but also more vulnerable. She took a deep breath, telling herself that she was safe, that Jack was still here, and that she'd be out the door soon enough. The routine comforted her, wrapping around her like a warm blanket pulled from childhood memory. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. Jack took another sip of coffee, savoring the warmth as it slid through him. He had no intention of rushing out. He came to the diner because it felt familiar, steady, and reliable in ways the world no longer seemed to be. For him, the quiet hours were a chance to think without being overwhelmed by the noise of modern life. Retirement hadn't softened his instincts. It had simply changed where he exercised them. And tonight, something in his spirit felt unsettled, like the air before a storm. He couldn't name it, but he recognized the tension as surely as he recognized his own reflection. Emily moved to the counter, gathering receipts and wiping down the register area while humming a tune her mother used to sing when she was little. It was a habit she fell into whenever she was nervous or tired, and tonight she felt a bit of both. She caught a glimpse of Jack in the reflection of the stainless steel coffee machine and felt a small wave of comfort knowing he was still there. He was one of those regulars who never caused trouble, never raised his voice, and always left a tip no matter how small. In a world that was changing fast, men like Jack felt like anchors. The clock above the counter ticked louder than usual, each second stretching just slightly longer than the one before. Emily checked her phone for the time, noticing that Frank and Linda had texted to ask if she made it through the rush earlier. She typed a quick reply assuring them everything was fine and that she'd finish closing soon. She didn't want them worrying. They treated her like family and trusted her with this place, a trust she carried heavily on nights like this. She told herself the stillness meant safety, but her pulse flickered with something she couldn't quite name. Jack shifted slightly in his booth, stretching his back and glancing toward the entrance, as though expecting something to happen. It wasn't paranoia, just the same instinct that had kept him alive through years of conflict overseas. Something about the night felt off rhythm, like a chord played half a beat too late. He couldn't see anything outside the windows except the reflection of the diner lights, but even that told him enough. He set down his coffee and rested his hands on the table, breathing slowly, letting the tension settle into awareness instead of anxiety. Emily reached for the last plate to be washed when she heard a faint sound from outside, something like footsteps or muffled voices near the front of the diner. Her heart paused before beating a little faster, though she tried to steady her breathing and tell herself it was nothing more than wind or passing animals. After all, the diner sat right next to farmland, and strange noises were part of the landscape. But something about the sound felt deliberate, human, and uncomfortably close. She glanced instinctively toward Jack, wondering if he heard it too. Jack raised his eyes at the exact same moment, locking onto the front door with a heightened focus that immediately changed the energy in the room. Emily felt a chill ripple up her spine, not because she understood what was happening yet, but because Jack did. It was the way he sat forward, the way his muscles tensed under his jacket, and the way his expression sharpened into the unmistakable look of a man alert to danger. The peaceful silence of the diner cracked open, and though Emily didn't know what was coming, she knew the night had shifted. Something or someone was approaching. The sudden pounding on the glass door shattered the quiet like an unexpected thunderclap, jerking Emily out of her fragile sense of calm. She spun toward the front, her heart racing as she saw the silhouettes of 3 men outside, leaning in close and knocking harder than necessary. Their shadows stretched across the window in the neon glow, giving them an unsettling presence even before she could make out their faces. She froze for a moment, gripping the edge of a booth as a jolt of fear rushed through her. People didn't show up at this hour, not decent people, anyway. Jack's eyes narrowed as he studied the men outside, watching their posture, their movements, and the way they carried themselves. Even through the glass, he could recognize the energy of trouble before it walked through a door. He had seen men like this before in bars overseas, in parking lots during late-night patrols, in moments where boredom and arrogance mixed into something dangerous. He didn't move yet, but he shifted his weight so he could stand at a moment's notice. Something about the way they banged on the door told him they weren't here for pie. Emily hesitated, torn between following policy and honoring that deep instinct warning her not to let them in. But their voices came through loud and impatient, demanding she open up because they just wanted something quick. She swallowed hard, wishing Frank or Linda were here, wishing anyone else were here. Still, she felt the familiar pressure to be polite, to avoid conflict, to not escalate something she didn't fully understand. She forced a shaky smile and unlocked the door, reasoning that refusing might make things worse. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in as the 3 out-of-towners stepped inside, bringing with them the scent of gasoline, cigarette smoke, and the kind of bravado that always spelled trouble. Travis Boone led the way, smirking as he looked Emily up and down with a confidence that made her stomach twist. Behind him, Eddie Brewer laughed loudly at nothing in particular, while Logan Price hovered with uneasy eyes, glancing around like someone who regretted tagging along. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing Emily's growing fear inside with them. Jack's presence faded into the background for the moment, but his awareness intensified. He watched silently as the men strutted through the diner, loud and out of place against the soft, humble textures of rural life hanging on the walls. Their swagger contradicted the respectful calm the diner normally held, and Jack could almost feel the shift in atmosphere like a drop in air pressure before a storm. He didn't like the way Travis walked, shoulders too loose, chin lifted just a little too high, the stride of a man looking for someone weaker to push around. Emily tried to keep her voice steady as she told them the diner was closed, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. But the men barely acknowledged her words. Travis brushed past her with a muttered comment about not being done yet, while Eddie let out a low whistle as he scanned the room. Logan offered a half-hearted shrug as though silently apologizing, but he didn't turn around. Emily felt her chest tighten as a wave of helplessness washed over her. She was alone with them, except for Jack, who hadn't moved but whose eyes tracked every step. The men laughed among themselves, talking too loudly and exaggerating every movement as if trying to claim the space by sheer volume. Their presence clashed with the diner's warm coziness and the photographs of old veterans lining the walls. Emily felt the mismatch like a weight pressing against her ribs. This was supposed to be a safe place, a homey refuge, not a stage for intimidation. She stepped back behind the counter, hoping that distance might offer some protection, even as she sensed it probably wouldn't. The air felt heavier with every second. Jack took a slow, steady breath, letting his training reawaken in the background of his mind. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, and he certainly didn't want to turn a simple confrontation into something worse than it needed to be. But he had learned long ago that danger often announces itself in subtle ways long before it explodes. And the way these men were acting, their entitlement, their disregard for Emily's words, echoed patterns he had seen in far darker places. He stayed in his booth, but he no longer felt relaxed. He felt ready. Emily forced a polite tone as she repeated that the diner was closed and that they needed to place their order quickly or come back in the morning. Travis smirked, leaning toward her with a casual arrogance that sent goosebumps crawling up her arms. Eddie snorted something under his breath that made Logan look away, uncomfortable but not enough to intervene. Emily's palms grew sweaty as she reached for a menu, trying to stall for time, hoping they'd get bored and leave. But the looks exchanged between the three men told her they weren't planning to go anywhere just yet. Jack finally shifted in his seat, a small movement that carried quiet weight. His boots planted firmly on the floor, his shoulders squared slightly, and his gaze locked onto the trio with the steady, unblinking assessment of a man who had seen too many situations like this end badly. He still didn't speak, but his posture changed the energy in the room just enough for Emily to notice out of the corner of her eye. She felt a strange sense of relief bloom inside her, not safety yet, but the hope of it. Jack wasn't just watching anymore. He was preparing. The moment the men settled into the diner, their energy shifted from loud inconvenience to something sharper and more unsettling. Travis sprawled across a booth with a swagger that claimed the entire space as his own, his boots squeaking loudly against the vinyl as he stretched out. Eddie leaned over the table, tapping his knuckles rhythmically as if warming up for a performance, while Logan stared at the salt shaker like he wished he could shrink down and disappear. The air thickened with their presence, their voices echoing in the quiet diner as they commented crudely on the decor, the food, and eventually, on Emily herself. Emily felt her stomach twist as Travis's gaze followed her across the room, lingering far longer than any decent customer would dare. His smirk grew bolder with each step she took, like he enjoyed watching her become smaller under his stare. Eddie joined in with sudden laughter, nudging Logan as if trying to pull him deeper into the group's rising arrogance. Emily swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady as she approached their table to ask what they wanted. But even the simple question seemed to give them permission to push boundaries further. As she took their order, Travis leaned in too close, pretending he couldn't hear her unless she came nearer. The smell of alcohol on his breath scraped against her nerves, making her fight the instinct to recoil. Eddie chimed in with crude jokes about how cute she sounded when she was nervous, while Logan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Emily kept her hands tightly wrapped around her notepad, hoping they wouldn't see the faint tremble running through her fingers. She wanted to stay professional, to get through this moment, but their laughter made that feel almost impossible. Jack observed everything with a stillness that carried more weight than movement. From his booth, he saw the shifting dynamics with practiced precision, the leader pushing forward, the follower amplifying him, and the third man caught between joining in and walking away. He watched the way Emily's shoulders tightened slightly every time Travis spoke, how she took half a step back when Eddie laughed too loudly, how her eyes avoided theirs except when absolutely necessary. Jack didn't intervene yet, but something cold and sharp settled in his gut. He knew where this kind of pattern could lead. Emily tried to redirect the energy by offering to pack up their food to go, hoping the gesture would encourage them to leave. She spoke firmly but politely, reminding them again that the diner was closed and she needed to wrap things up for the night. Travis responded with a mocking chuckle, asking if she was in a hurry to get somewhere, or if she just didn't like making friends. Eddie slapped the table, laughing like it was the funniest comment he'd ever heard, while Logan stared at the floor, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to break the group dynamic. Emily felt her pulse quicken. The atmosphere grew heavier as the men began exchanging looks that said they had no intention of going anywhere. Travis drummed his fingers on the table, eyeing Emily like she was part of the entertainment, instead of a worker just trying to close up and go home. Eddie elbowed Logan, trying to rile him up, but Logan only forced a half smile, torn between unease and the need not to seem weak in front of his friends. Emily could feel the diner's familiar warmth being overtaken by something darker, a presence that didn't belong in this place she loved. Jack's jaw tightened as he continued watching, the muscles in his forearm flexing subtly as he gripped his coffee mug. He wasn't a man quick to act. Years of service had taught him to measure every decision carefully, but he also wasn't blind to the danger creeping closer. He saw the shift in Emily's stance, the way she kept glancing toward the front door as though calculating the fastest way out. He recognized fear disguised as professionalism, the same expression he'd seen on young soldiers trying to appear brave in situations that demanded far more than courage alone. Emily stepped back behind the counter to put distance between herself and the men, hoping her position on the opposite side would create some invisible barrier of safety. But their voices followed her, comments growing bolder, tone growing harsher, as though her attempt to retreat only fueled their amusement. Travis called out another joke at her expense, Eddie encouraging him with a laugh so loud it bounced off the stainless steel appliances. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks, part embarrassment, part fear, and part frustration that she couldn't simply send them out the door. The diner, once filled with the sounds of easy conversation and clinking dishes, now seemed alive only with the tension they brought in. The framed photos of veterans on the wall seemed to watch silently from their places, reminders of the values this town held dear: respect, honor, integrity. Emily drew strength from that reminder, steadying her breath and trying once more to maintain control over her own space. But beneath her practiced calm, her hands remained slightly unsteady, betraying the anxiety she didn't want Jack or the men to see. Jack leaned forward just a fraction, elbows resting on the table as he studied the group with the focus of a man preparing for something he wished wouldn't come. He still didn't move or speak, but the shift in his posture was unmistakable, a quiet acknowledgement that the situation was heading down a path he knew all too well. The peaceful night the diner began with was slipping away, and Jack could feel the tension rising like the slow pull of a tightening rope. The harassment had begun, and he knew the storm had only just started. Emily tried to regain control of the situation by stepping toward the counter phone, hoping to discreetly check the time or at least create a buffer of authority. But before she could take more than a few steps, Travis moved from the booth with a casual arrogance that sent a cold shock through her. He positioned himself between her and the phone, leaning against the counter as though he owned the place. Eddie followed closely behind, acting like an eager shadow, while Logan remained seated but tense, caught between discomfort and loyalty to his friends. The sudden closeness made Emily's breath catch. Travis reached toward the napkin dispenser, but instead of grabbing a napkin, he tugged lightly on Emily's apron string with a smirk spreading across his face. "Relax," he muttered, as if she were overreacting by instinctively pulling back. Eddie laughed loudly, slapping the counter as though this moment were a harmless joke shared among friends. But Emily felt the air rush from her lungs, her chest tightening as she struggled to keep her expression steady. Her heart pounded so loudly she could almost hear it echoing through the empty diner. The world around her seemed to shrink into the few feet separating her from the men. Every sound became magnified: the hum of the fridge, the creak of Travis's boots, the uneven rhythm of her own shallow breathing. She stepped back until the edge of the counter pressed against her spine, trapping her between the cold surface and Travis's looming presence. She forced herself to maintain a polite tone, trying to diffuse the situation with words, but her voice trembled slightly despite her best efforts. She felt small, cornered, and frighteningly alone. Jack watched the interaction with a growing intensity, the shift in Emily's posture hitting him harder than any words could. He saw the fear in her eyes, the silent plea she tried to hide, and he felt an old familiar weight settle across his shoulders, the weight of responsibility, of duty, of stepping in before anything irreversible happened. His fingers tightened subtly around the edge of his table, muscles coiling with instinctive readiness. Yet he held himself still for the moment, waiting for absolute clarity before he intervened. He knew escalation had to be controlled, not triggered. Emily's mind raced as she tried to calculate her options. The front door was blocked by the men, and the phone she relied on for emergencies was just out of reach. Even if she could call for help, she didn't know how Travis and Eddie would react. She didn't want to make them angrier. She didn't want to provoke anything worse. But the boundary she'd been trying to maintain had already been crossed. The moment Travis touched her apron, the fragile line between rudeness and real danger snapped. She felt it in her stomach like a punch. Travis leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper as he commented on how jumpy she was. Eddie snorted another crude remark, nudging Travis's arm as if encouraging him to continue. Logan shifted in the booth, his discomfort visible now, but still he said nothing. Emily's throat tightened, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She had never felt this vulnerable before, not here, not in the place that had always felt like a second home. The fear crawled under her skin like ice. Jack's jaw clenched as he rose slightly in his seat, just an inch, just enough to shift his weight forward and prepare for what might come next. His eyes never left Emily, tracking every detail with the precision of a man trained to read danger long before it strikes. He didn't want to frighten her by intervening too soon, but he could also see that she was no longer in control of the situation. The quiet, disciplined voice in his mind, the one he'd heard in deserts, in forests, in villages abroad, whispered that waiting much longer could be a mistake. Emily tried once more to assert herself, her voice cracking despite her attempt to sound firm. She told them again that the diner was closed and that they needed to leave. But Travis chuckled, stepping even closer, using his height to loom over her in a way that made her feel like the walls were closing in. Eddie mumbled something about her being too serious, while Logan muttered that maybe they should ease up. But his half-hearted protest was swallowed by the heavy tension filling the room. Emily's breath hitched, fear shimmering behind her eyes. Her thoughts began to spin in frantic circles. What if they don't leave? What if Jack doesn't notice? What if this gets worse? She felt helpless, isolated, caught between the instinct to scream and the fear of making everything explode into violence. Her voice shook as she asked them once more to step back, but the request only made Travis laugh harder. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest until she could barely breathe. She didn't know how to get out of this without making everything worse. Jack finally exhaled, his decision solidifying like a final piece clicking into place. The moment he saw Emily shrink back against the counter, he knew he could no longer remain seated. The time for restraint had ended. The time for action had arrived. Without a word, he He shifted his body upright with a calm, controlled movement that carried quiet authority. His boots touched the floor with purpose. The air in the diner shifted, tension giving way to a dawning sense of change, as if the room itself felt a protector rising. And while the men didn't notice him yet, Emily did. Her eyes flicked toward him with a spark of hope. Emily steadied her breath and tried once more to regain a sense of control, even though her heart still raced from the way Travis had cornered her moments earlier. She clasped her hands together to stop them from trembling and forced her voice into something that resembled authority. She offered again to pack their food to go, reminding the men in a polite but exhausted tone that the diner was already closed and she needed to finish her shift. Her words were calm on the surface, but beneath them lived a fragile desperation, an unspoken plea for the situation to turn toward safety instead of danger. Travis leaned back with an exaggerated sigh, pretending to consider her offer before brushing it off with a smirk that made Emily's stomach tighten. He made a crude remark about how a pretty girl like you shouldn't rush the night, and Eddie laughed loudly, slapping the table as if Travis had something clever. Emily's cheeks flushed, a mix of fear and humiliation heating her skin, but she didn't let her expression crack. She repeated that the diner was closed, her voice trembling only slightly. The men ignored the boundary completely, treating her words as entertainment rather than a request. Eddie stood and walked toward the counter, his grin wide and careless, peeking over the equipment as if he belonged behind it. Emily moved subtly to block him, but he didn't care. His proximity alone was meant to unnerve her. He asked questions she didn't want to answer, leaning closer than necessary as he examined the laminated menus. Logan trailed behind them more slowly, his eyes darting anxiously between his friends and Emily, but he still didn't speak. The imbalance of power felt suffocating, and Emily could feel every instinct inside her screaming for distance she could not create. Jack observed the escalating tension with increasing focus, his calm demeanor sharpening into something deliberate and controlled. He noted how Emily tried to de-escalate without showing panic, how she attempted to maintain professionalism even as fear rose behind her eyes. Her voice carried the weight of someone doing everything she could to prevent a bad situation from becoming worse. Jack respected her effort, but he also recognized the unmistakable signs that her strategies were failing. He could see the path unfolding, a path he had seen many times before, one that required intervention before harm took place. Trying a different tactic, Emily mentioned softly that the sheriff sometimes stopped by to check on things this late at night. She hoped the suggestion would plant enough doubt in the men's minds to make them reconsider their behavior. But Travis just chuckled, stepping closer to her as he said he wasn't afraid of some small-town deputy. Eddie elbowed Logan again, making a joke about the sheriff needing to mind his own business, and Logan's forced laugh came out thin and strained. Emily realized then that name-dropping law enforcement wasn't going to help her tonight. Jack finally spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying a calm authority that seemed to ripple across the room. He told the men they had been given plenty of chances to order food, and that Emily had already said the diner was closed. His tone wasn't confrontational, but it was unmistakably firm, an invitation for them to walk away with their pride intact. For a split second, the room went quiet as the men processed the unexpected interruption. Emily felt a wave of relief sweep through her, grateful that someone had finally given voice to the boundary she couldn't enforce alone. Travis turned toward Jack with a mocking half-smile, his expression shifting into something defensive and dismissive. "Relax, Grandpa," he said, waving a hand as though brushing off a fly. Eddie burst into laughter again, emboldened by Travis's bravado, while Logan looked down at his hands, his discomfort deepening. The disrespect rolled off Travis's tongue effortlessly, as if belittling older men was part of his routine. Emily's stomach clenched at the insult, casting a worried look toward Jack, but Jack remained composed, his expression unreadable, his posture steady. Emily stepped back slightly, torn between relief and fear. She didn't want Jack to get dragged into something dangerous, but she also didn't want to be alone with these men anymore. She saw the line forming in the sand, Travis's pride swelling, Jack's patience thinning, and her own safety hanging somewhere between them. She whispered another reminder that the diner was closed, but the men ignored her again. The tension tightened like a rope pulled from both ends, each second stretching longer and heavier. Jack tried once more to keep things from escalating. He offered them a final chance to take their food and leave peacefully, emphasizing that no one wanted trouble. His tone remained calm, but the underlying strength in his voice made the words feel carved from stone. He wasn't pleading. He was offering them a way out, one last moment of choice, before things went places they couldn't undo. But Travis heard Jack's control as a challenge rather than a warning. His pride flared, and he puffed his chest out, ready to prove himself in front of his friends. The fragile barrier of peace cracked in that moment. Emily felt it inside her chest, a sinking certainty that the night had reached a dangerous turning point. What had begun as rude behavior had grown into outright dismissal of her voice and Jack's authority. The men had tested boundaries again and again, and now, with Travis's ego fully engaged and Jack stepping into the role of protector, the next step felt inevitable. The de-escalation had failed, every polite attempt exhausted, every warning ignored. Something darker was coming, and Emily sensed they were teetering on the edge of a storm. Emily took a small step back as Travis leaned toward her again, but this time his approach held none of the mocking playfulness he'd shown earlier. His expression hardened as he reached out suddenly, grabbing her wrist with a careless force that sent a jolt of panic through her entire body. She gasped involuntarily, her free hand pressing against the counter for support as she tried to pull away. The room seemed to constrict around her, every sound muffled except the pounding of her own heartbeat. This wasn't teasing, and it wasn't harmless. This was danger, real and immediate. Eddie laughed loudly, egging Travis on as if this moment were some kind of drunken game. He nudged Travis's shoulder, muttering something crude under his breath that made Emily's stomach twist even tighter. Logan's eyes widened in alarm, and for the first time he looked genuinely shocked by what was happening. "Hey man, maybe chill," he said softly, but the words came out weak and uncertain, drowned beneath Eddie's laughter and Travis's tightening grip. The helplessness Emily had been trying to push down all night surged to the surface, threatening to spill over. Her voice cracked as she told Travis to let go, the tremble betraying just how frightened she truly was. She tried to keep her tone steady, reminding him she needed to close the diner and that he was crossing the line. But her words only made him smirk, as if her discomfort fueled some twisted sense of power. He tugged her wrist again, leaning in closer, his voice dripping with mock concern as he asked why she was so jumpy. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, tears of fear, frustration, and the sickening realization that she couldn't stop this on her own. Jack stood up without hesitation, pushing aside his coffee cup with a firm, controlled motion that echoed through the booth. His calm, steady rise carried more force than any shout could have, an unmistakable shift in power that filled the diner with a new kind of tension. He took a step forward, his boots striking the floor with quiet authority, and his eyes locked onto Travis with a look that silenced even Eddie's laughter for a moment. Emily glanced toward him with a flicker of desperate hope, her breath catching at the sight of him standing. Travis turned slowly, still gripping Emily's wrist as he faced Jack with narrowed eyes. He squared his shoulders in a show of defiance, letting out a scoffing laugh as if amused that someone older dared intervene. "What's your problem, old man?" he asked, his tone mocking but slightly strained. Eddie moved behind him, browsing for the same confidence but landing somewhere between bravado and unease. Logan stepped back from the booth, shifting his weight as though unsure whether to stay or flee. The room felt on the verge of exploding. Jack's voice came out low and even, carrying the weight of a man who'd spent his life commanding attention without raising his volume. He told Travis calmly to let the girl go, giving him a single chance to step back, gather his friends, and walk out the door without anything getting worse. His tone wasn't angry, it was resolute, grounded in quiet strength, born from years of training and moral conviction. Emily felt her breath steady just slightly at the sound, her trembling fingers loosening as she sensed someone finally standing between her and harm. Travis hesitated for just a moment, his grip loosening slightly as he registered the unwavering confidence in Jack's stance. But pride quickly drowned out caution. He scoffed again and leaned forward, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. "Why don't you mind your own business?" he snapped, jerking Emily's wrist again as if to prove his point. Eddie shouted something encouraging behind him, but even he didn't step closer. Logan whispered a shaky, "Come on, Travis," but his voice shook with fear, revealing the crack forming within the group's unity. Emily's breath hitched as the pressure on her wrist intensified, and she let out a quiet, fearful, "Please," the kind of plea that came from the deepest part of someone who had run out of options. Her eyes darted between Travis and Jack, desperate for the moment to end but terrified of what might happen next. She felt herself shrinking inward, but somewhere in her chest, a spark of hope remained, fueled solely by Jack's presence. She had never needed someone's help this badly, and the vulnerability of that realization shook her deeply. Jack took another step forward, placing himself physically between Emily and the escalating threat. His posture was calm but unyielding, his eyes locked on Travis with an intensity that cut through the room like a blade. He repeated, with slow and deliberate emphasis, that Travis needed to let her go. There was no shout, no raised voice, just the absolute clarity of a man who had seen real violence and was prepared to prevent it herewith, controlled force if necessary. The entire diner held its breath, suspended on the edge of a moment about to break. Then, after one last moment of tension, Travis finally released Emily's wrist, not because he wanted to, but because Jack's presence made it impossible to maintain the charade of dominance. The shift was small but unmistakable. Emily stumbled back behind the counter, cradling her wrist as she fought the urge to cry. Jack positioned himself fully between her and the men, his stance protective and immovable. The atmosphere pulsed with a new energy, now fear, defiance, and the unmistakable emergence of a hidden hero no one had expected to rise. The line had been crossed, and nothing would be the same. The diner fell into a thick, electric silence as Jack stepped fully into the open space between Emily and the men, his stance steady and anchored like a wall built from decades of discipline. Travis stared at him with narrowed eyes, his jaw twitching as though he couldn't decide whether to back down or double down. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting long shadows across the floor that made the quiet moment feel even more charged. Emily, now behind Jack, clutched her wrist and felt her breath return in shaky waves. For the first time all night, she wasn't alone. Travis puffed out his chest and scoffed, his pride refusing to let him step away without a show. He took a step toward Jack, closing the gap between them with a swagger meant to project confidence he no longer fully possessed. "Look at this hero," Travis muttered, voice dripping with mockery as he tilted his chin up. Eddie echoed the comment with a snort, but the sound lacked the enthusiasm it carried earlier. Logan remained at the back, uncertainty etched across his face, clearly struggling with the line between loyalty and self-preservation. Jack didn't flinch or shift his stance. His expression remained calm but unshakably firm, a presence carved from something deeper than physical strength. He kept his eyes locked on Travis, unblinking and steady, the kind of gaze that made lesser men reconsider their bravado. Without raising his voice, Jack told them again that the night was over, the diner was closed, and they needed to leave peacefully. His tone carried the authority of a man who had spent his life navigating high-stakes moments, and it cut through the air like a command meant to be followed. Travis attempted to laugh, but the sound cracked around the edges, revealing the tension creeping into his confidence. He stepped even closer, close enough for Jack to smell the alcohol on his breath, but Jack didn't move an inch. That stillness unnerved Travis more than any display of aggression could have. "You think you can tell us what to do?" he sneered, leaning closer as if trying to provoke a reaction. The question hung in the air, hollow and insecure, fueled more by bruised ego than genuine threat. Travis's bravado now stood on shaky ground. Eddie moved behind Travis, trying to maintain the group's image of fearlessness, but his stance lacked conviction. His eyes flicked between Jack's posture and Emily's trembling form, as though realizing the situation had grown far beyond harmless fun. Logan remained several steps away, his hands fidgeting as he shifted from foot to foot. He muttered under his breath that maybe they should just leave, but Travis brushed him off with a glare that silenced him instantly. The trio's unity, once loud and unbreakable, now showed visible cracks under pressure. Emily watched everything unfold with a mixture of fear and awe. The trembling in her hands hadn't stopped, but seeing Jack standing so firmly in front of her sent a warmth through her chest, a fragile thread of safety returning to her heart. She could feel how the room had shifted, how Jack's presence had changed the balance of power entirely. Her voice caught in her throat as she whispered for Travis to stop, but the words barely carried past Jack's shoulder. Even so, the simple sound was enough to remind her she wasn't invisible anymore. Jack remained grounded, his breathing steady and controlled, every movement measured with the precision of someone who had trained for moments exactly like this. He wasn't aggressive. He was resolute. He warned Travis a final time in a tone so low and controlled it carried more threat than shouting ever could. He didn't need to puff out his chest or raise his fists. His confidence came from experience, from survival, from a lifetime of protecting others. And Travis felt the difference between a pretender and a man who had lived through real danger. The trio shifted uncomfortably as Jack took one deliberate step forward, placing himself even more squarely between Emily and the danger. The small movement changed everything. Travis faltered for a moment, taking a half step back before forcing himself not to retreat. Eddie's smirk faded completely as he realized Jack was not bluffing. Logan whispered again that they should stop, but his voice went unheard beneath the rising tension. The air felt thick, charged, like a storm reaching its breaking point. Travis, unable to accept the erosion of his dominance, clenched his fists and stepped forward again, puffing himself up with false courage. His eyes widened slightly as he looked Jack up and down, finally understanding the magnitude of the man standing before him. But his pride refused to let him walk away. "What are you gonna do?" he taunted, his voice lower, more strained than before. It was a question asked by someone who already feared the answer. And Jack's steady, silent stare told him everything he needed to know. The moment stretched, hovering in the fragile space between confrontation and violence. The diner lights buzzed, Emily held her breath, and Jack's posture remained flawless, centered, prepared, disciplined. Travis's bravado faltered under the weight of Jack's unwavering presence. And in that moment, everyone in the room felt it. The confrontation had fully ignited. There was no turning back. The storm had begun, and the first crack of thunder echoed in the silence. The tension snapped the moment Travis lunged forward, swinging at Jack with the reckless aggression of someone fueled by alcohol and wounded pride. His fist cut through the air in a clumsy arc, but before it could land, Jack moved with a speed and precision that stunned the entire room. He stepped slightly off the line of attack, his body shifting in one fluid motion that came from decades of disciplined training. Travis's momentum met empty space, and the sudden imbalance caused him to stumble forward, eyes wide with surprise. Jack reacted instinctively, gripping Travis's wrist and redirecting his force downward with controlled efficiency. In a single, practiced movement, he guided Travis to the floor, using just enough strength to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm. Travis hit the ground with a thud that echoed through the diner, the air knocked from his lungs in a gasp. Eddie froze, his mouth falling open, while Logan took 2 steps back, eyes wide with disbelief. The fight had begun and ended faster than any of them could process. Eddie's bravado vanished as he stared at his friend on the ground, stunned by how quickly Jack had taken control. His hands twitched at his sides, as though considering stepping in. But the certainty faded from his posture the longer he looked at Jack. Logan, now pale and visibly shaken, muttered something unintelligible, his voice trembling with fear. The entire dynamic of the room had shifted in an instant, power stripped away from the attackers and placed squarely into the hands of the quiet, steady veteran. Jack stood over Travis with calm authority, his breathing even, his posture grounded. He didn't raise his fists, didn't scream, didn't escalate. Instead, he released Travis's wrist and stepped back, giving him a clear path to stand and leave. The message was unmistakable. The confrontation was over if they chose to walk away. His discipline was clear in every line of his body. This was not about anger or violence. It was about protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. And that control made him infinitely more intimidating than if he had struck back in rage. Travis groaned and rolled to his side, clutching his ribs as he struggled to catch his breath. His expression, once full of arrogance, now twisted into a mixture of pain and disbelief. Eddie took a hesitant half-step forward, as if to check on him, but Jack's steady gaze halted him before he could get close. Logan whispered anxiously for them to leave, his voice cracking, realizing that the situation had spiraled far beyond anything he wanted to be part of. The facade of strength the trio carried had shattered completely. Emily watched from behind the counter, her heart pounding but her relief swelling. She had never seen anything like what just happened, so fast, so controlled, so undeniably protective. Her breath trembled as she tried to steady herself, her hands clutching the counter for support. Seeing Jack handle the situation with such discipline made tears gather at the edges of her eyes. Not from fear now, but from the overwhelming relief that someone had finally stopped the danger she couldn't. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but her spirit felt lighter. Jack didn't move aggressively toward the men. Instead, he positioned himself calmly between them and Emily, a human shield built of experience and resolve. He told them firmly that the night was over, that they were leaving now, and that the next step was theirs to decide. His tone carried a finality that left no room for argument. Eddie swallowed hard, his earlier bravado dissolving into fear. Logan nodded rapidly, urging Travis to get up and go. Even Travis, pride wounded and body aching, recognized that staying would only end in more humiliation. Travis finally pushed himself to his feet, staggering slightly as he regained his balance. His eyes burned with resentment, but the fire of arrogance had dimmed under the weight of humiliation. Eddie grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door as Logan stood by, ready to bolt. Emily held her breath as the trio glanced back one last time, muttering empty threats they no longer had the courage to act on. Their footsteps echoed as they retreated, each step growing faster until they reached the door. Jack remained still, watching them leave without taking a single step toward them. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to escort them out. The doors slammed behind the trio as they stumbled into the night, tension dissolving in their wake. The diner fell into a heavy quiet, the storm finally breaking, leaving only the soft hum of the lights and Emily's shaky breathing behind. Jack exhaled slowly, the adrenaline settling in his veins, but his calm exterior never wavered. The fight had lasted only seconds, but its impact filled the room like an unspoken truth. Emily was safe. The threat was gone. And Jack, without seeking attention or glory, had done exactly what his code demanded: protect the vulnerable, act with honor, and restrain violence even when forced to confront it. The justice delivered was not loud or dramatic. It was precise, disciplined, and rooted in duty. And in the quiet aftermath, Emily realized her life might have taken a very different turn if not for the man who rose from the back booth at exactly the moment she needed him most. The diner sank into a heavy, breathless silence as the door slammed behind the fleeing troublemakers, leaving behind only the distant echo of their retreat. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her shaken body processing the sudden shift from fear to safety. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation now drained, leaving her legs trembling and her breath unsteady. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat thundering beneath her palm. The room felt both eerily quiet and overwhelmingly alive, every detail sharper in the aftermath of danger. Jack turned toward Emily with a slow, steady movement, his expression gentle despite the tension still lingering in his posture. He asked if she was hurt, keeping his voice low and calm, the tone of a man trained to steady others long before steadying himself. Emily shook her head at first, unable to find her voice. Then she finally whispered that she was okay, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. She looked at her wrist with a wince, rubbing gently where Travis had grabbed her, the faint redness a stark reminder of how close things had come to spiraling further. Jack stepped closer with the careful respect of someone who understood boundaries, offering his presence without overwhelming her. He asked again, more softly this time, if she needed medical attention or wanted him to call someone. Emily shook her head again, tears welling in her eyes as the fear she'd been holding back finally began to dissolve. She felt safe now, safer than she had felt since the men arrived, but the release of tension brought an unexpected wave of emotion. She tried to swallow it down, but her breath caught in her throat, betraying her vulnerability. Unable to hold it any longer, Emily let out a small, trembling sob, covering her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just the honest, involuntary release of someone who had been pushed beyond their limit. Jack didn't crowd her or say anything unnecessary. Instead, he remained close enough to offer comfort without intruding. He spoke softly, telling her it was over, that she was safe, and that none of what happened was her fault. His steady reassurance wrapped around her like a warm blanket after standing too long in the cold. Emily nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve as she steadied her breathing. She apologized out of habit, something many young women did without realizing, saying she was sorry for making a scene, sorry for getting him involved. Jack shook his head immediately, his expression firm as he told her she had nothing to apologize for. His voice carried the conviction of a man who believed deeply in doing what was right. He told her that she handled herself with courage, and that stepping in was simply the right thing to do. His sincerity made her shoulders loosen, the guilt fading away. Once Emily regained enough composure to move, Jack helped her straighten a chair that had been knocked over in the scuffle. He didn't rush the process, giving her time to breathe and settle. The simple act of restoring the space brought a fragile sense of normalcy back into the room. Emily watched him as he worked quietly, noticing the steadiness in his posture and the gentleness in the way he handled everything. It struck her that he wasn't doing this to be thanked or admired. He was doing it because it was the kind of man he chose to be. Even after the uniform was gone, Emily finally found her voice enough to thank him, though the words felt too small for what he had done. Jack gave her a nod and a modest smile, brushing it off as though he hadn't done anything extraordinary. He told her he was just glad he could help, that no one deserved to feel unsafe at their job, especially not someone working hard late into the night. His humility made her eyes sting again, but she managed to hold back more tears, not wanting to break down a second time. She appreciated that he treated her with respect, not pity. She asked him quietly if he thought the men would come back. Jack shook his head, assuring her they wouldn't, not after the way they had left. He explained that men like that relied on power in numbers and weren't accustomed to facing someone who stood firm. Fear had replaced their bravado by the time they reached the door, and fear tended to keep people away. Emily took comfort in his words, trusting his judgment far more than her own shaken instincts. She let out a slow exhale, the tension in her chest finally easing. After a few minutes, Emily offered to pour Jack another cup of coffee, a gesture of gratitude she didn't know how else to express. Jack accepted with a humble nod, not wanting to make her feel obligated, but understanding the comfort in returning to something familiar. As she filled the cup, her hands steadier now, the diner's hum returned, soft and warm. The clink of the coffee pot against the mug, the glow of the overhead lights, and the faint scent of pie cooling behind the counter, all helped rebuild the sense of peace that had been broken. Standing there in the quiet, Jack told her she had handled herself bravely. Emily looked up at him, absorbing the words like nourishment after a long starvation. She hadn't felt brave, only frightened and overwhelmed, but Jack's steady affirmation helped reshape the moment into something survivable, something meaningful. The night had tested her deeply, but she hadn't faced it alone. As the diner settled back into stillness, Emily realized she would never forget the man who stepped forward when no one else would, and Jack knew, in his bones, that he had done exactly what duty demanded of him, uniform or not. In the days that followed, word quietly spread through the small rural community about what had happened that night at the diner. People didn't gossip loudly. This wasn't a town of exaggeration or spectacle, but news traveled in a gentle, steady way. A neighbor mentioned it at the hardware store. Someone else brought it up at the feed shop. By Sunday morning, whispers drifted through the church pews about Emily's frightening encounter, and the retired Army Ranger who stepped in without hesitation. Respect grew naturally, carried by the townspeople like an unspoken prayer. Emily returned to work the next day with a mix of lingering nerves and renewed strength. The diner's regulars greeted her with warmth, unaware at first of what she had endured. But as some began to learn the story, their kindness deepened, offering her small reassurances, words of comfort, and reminders that she was part of a community that looked out for its own. She stood taller with each passing hour, no longer questioning whether she belonged, or whether anyone would stand up for her. The memory of Jack stepping between her and danger had planted a new kind of courage inside her. Frank and Linda, the diner's owners, placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder after hearing what happened, their expressions filled with concern and quiet gratitude. They assured her she had done everything right, and that they never expected her to shoulder such a frightening moment alone. They asked her if she wanted time off, but she declined, wanting instead to reclaim the space that had always felt like a second home. They later added a small framed sign near the counter, a simple thank you to veterans for their service, though everyone knew who had inspired it. Jack, for his part, didn't seek recognition or praise. He stopped by the diner a couple of days later, ordering his usual coffee and slice of pie with the humble calm of a man just going about his day. Some folks nodded to him with a deeper level of respect than before, but he didn't respond with pride or arrogance. He simply offered a polite nod back, the kind given by someone who understood that honor wasn't a show. It was a quiet, lifelong duty, something carried inside, not displayed for applause. Emily felt a swell of gratitude when she saw him walk through the door again. She poured his coffee with a steadier hand this time, offering a sincere smile instead of the anxious one she'd worn before. She thanked him again, not for the fight itself, but for the dignity and calm he had given her afterward. Jack waved away the praise gently, reminding her that anyone with a good heart would have stepped in. But Emily knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would put themselves between danger and someone else. Jack had, and that mattered. As the town processed the story, it reshaped the quiet perception people had of Jack, the man who once sat alone in the back booth became a symbol of something deeper, of the veterans who lived among them, carrying decades of service within their bones. Folks began to see him not just as a quiet regular, but as a reminder of the values they cherished: courage, integrity, humility, and the unwavering commitment to protect what is right. It wasn't about the fight. It was about the character behind it. Emily found herself growing stronger in the aftermath, no longer shrinking at shadows or second-guessing her worth. She understood now that her voice mattered, and that there were good people in the world willing to defend it. Her experience didn't make her fearful. It made her aware of her own resilience. It showed her that danger could come unexpectedly, but so could grace, so could protection. So could a man like Jack Coleman quietly standing from a booth to change the course of a night. Jack returned to his routine, living with the same quiet discipline he always had. But something inside him shifted too. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that the oath he took as a young soldier wasn't tied to a uniform or a battlefield. It was tied to who he was. Protecting someone in need didn't reopen old wounds. It reaffirmed the values he had spent his life building. In a world that often felt chaotic and divided, he had witnessed firsthand that honor still mattered, that goodness still existed, and that small-town America still held tightly to its heart. In time, the incident became more of a lesson than a story, A reminder whispered through the community that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act anyway. Emily carried that lesson with her on every late shift, greeting customers with a steadier voice and a clearer sense of her own worth. Jack carried it too, sitting in his booth with the quiet confidence of a protector who didn't need acknowledgement. The diner became a little brighter, the town a little more connected, bound by the shared belief that heroes still walk among ordinary places. And as the narrator's voice settles over the final moment, a message lingers. In small towns across America, in diners and gas stations and grocery stores, there are still people like Emily Young, hardworking, standing tall against a world that can be harsh. And there are still people like Jack, retired in name, but never in spirit, ready to rise when the moment calls. Honor doesn't retire. Courage doesn't fade. And somewhere in your own town, there might be a Jack quietly finishing his coffee, watching over someone who doesn't yet know they're safe.